Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to Ask Zajef Alhaitham Edition. Woohoo! This is the first time that we're doing an Ask Zajef Alhaitham because it is the first rerun. So, let's just move right into it with the first question. What is his overall place on the meta, pull value, compared to the other 3.75 stars, and how much has changed with him since his initial run? Okay, what's his overall place on the meta? Overall, he's just fairly strong. In 3.7, who are the 5 stars that we're getting? Again, there's Yaimiko, Yoimiya, Kazuha, and him. But yeah, I would argue that he is the second best out of those 4. Mainly just because, in general, I think that supports tend to have more value. But it's very possible that on your account, you'd gain more out of Alhaitham than you would out of Kazuha. In any case, I guess I should talk a little bit about why he's a fairly good unit. Basically, he's a carry that doesn't need to only rely on his own damage to have the team, like, do good things, right? Basically, he's a Dendro unit and a carry. And that's really nice because, I mean, the Dendro teams in general, they lend themselves really well to having a lot of different units contribute to your team's DPS. Because when it comes to Quicken, both Spread and Aggravate have pretty similar damage output. So you're basically getting the same bonuses on both your Dendro and your Electro units from that reaction. Which means that if both the units have like low ICD or whatever, or just like fast application, or if they have high damage, like they can both be contributing to the team's DPS. And also, when it comes to Hyperbloom or Burgeon team, well, as a Dendro unit, he can't trigger the Hyperbloom or Burgeon himself, and so you'll have someone else who is also contributing to the damage. He's a good unit, basically. In the pre-release and post-release thoughts, I mentioned how he is not nearly as valuable of a pull if you already have Nahida, and I do still think that's the case. Like, basically in the sense that generally many of his teams get improved by having Nahida on the team, and otherwise you could often replace him with Nahida on a team. So if you were to choose between one of the two, I'd basically always say that you're better off going for Nahida. But like Nahida does improve his teams, and he actually has teams with Nahida where he performs very well. But also, and honestly maybe more importantly, recent Abysses have been pretty cringe in terms of like the kind of requirements that they have, often kind of forcing you to have a Dendro. I mean, the current Abyss doesn't really force you to have a Dendro, but it does incentivize you to have a Dendro by having a pretty tanky Hydro Shield on top of Pyro Shields, which makes it so that you want to have Hydro, but you also want to have either Cryo or Dendro to break that Hydro Shield, but generally you don't really want to be using freeze teams in the current Abyss on the second side. Point being, you're incentivized to use Dendro, and so it might force you to use Nahida in a team where you wouldn't really want to be using her to begin with, which would leave your other side without a way of doing like traditional Dendro team, and Alhaitham could be slotted in there to have like another strong side on the other side, basically. In any case, I don't think that much has changed with him. I think he's still basically in the same situation. At the end of the day, I still consider him to basically be a luxury unit. I don't think there's any like carries that are good enough that I'd recommend going for them before you like get all of the supports that you want. But among the carries, he is one of the better ones for sure. How reliant is he on Nahida, and how much worse does he fare in his teams without her? This basically depends a lot on the kind of archetypes. When you're not using Nahida, you're basically either using him as solo Dendro, in which case his personal damage will go down quite a bit because, well, you're very much going to want to have Deepwood on him, so it's going to force you into an artifact that doesn't give you as many stats as Gilded wants, or as Gilded can give you. You're going to have higher ER requirements. That generally means you're going to have to sacrifice damage, and also Nahida's EM buff isn't going to apply to him. But that can mean that you get like more out of your like additional Hydro application for reactions, or additional like Electro unit that does a bunch of damage themselves. His teams are almost always worse without Nahida than they are with Nahida, but he actually does have pretty solid teams without her. You can always use him just basically either in a Quicken core where you use him, generally Kuki because he doesn't have great synergy with Fischl, and Kuki can fill the healer slot, and then kind of just double flex. In that archetype, I think that the teams without Nahida generally perform a lot worse because, well, you have 100% quicken uptime, so Nahida's personal damage matters a lot more, and the buff also matters a lot. But when you look at like the Hyperbloom teams, right, the ones where you also add in like a Hydro unit, so Xingqi or Yelan as the third option, the last slot doesn't necessarily have to be Nahida, and there's a lot of options that, while maybe not quite as good, still do perform pretty well. And yeah, the reason why he doesn't have great synergy with Fischl is because when you're using him on field, the enemy will have, well, they'll be quickened, but they'll also have underlying Dendro aura. And what that means is that you won't be able to apply underlying Dendro with the quicken. So the only reaction that Alhaitham will trigger is spread, right? He'll trigger spread and reapply underlying Dendro, and then whenever Fischl hits with Electro, she will trigger quicken. But spread itself is not an Electro reaction, which means that it doesn't actually proc Fischl's Ascension 4 talent, right? Because it's not, spread is not considered to be an Electro-related elemental reaction, and because it doesn't proc this, then you lose a lot of damage from Fischl, or you're missing out on a lot of damage from Fischl, which means that the synergy is just not nearly as good. She can still work in his teams, but you're losing a lot of value out of her. How much worse is using him in lieu of Nahida as solo Dendro? It very much depends on what you're fighting. Against enemies that, like, you just keep fighting them, there's one boss enemy, whatever, it's not too bad. The main, like, potential issue that can start happening is once you get to, like, the second rotation with Nahida, you still have Nahida's E on the enemy, which means that during your setup, you're generating more blooms. Whereas with Alhaitham, on your second rotation, when you're not on him, you're not applying any Dendro anymore, so you're not generating blooms during your setup. So that's kind of something that works against him a little bit for extended fights. And then just obviously Nahida's AoE is basically infinite, whereas his AoE is not the biggest. And also, and maybe most important, you can swap out of Nahida whenever you want. So when you're against very aggressive enemies, if you feel like you're about to die, on Nahida you can just swap out. On him, well, if you swap out, you can't apply Dendro anymore and you lose a lot of damage. Despite the good synergy he has with Nahida, does a player's ownership or lack of Nahida affect his pull value? Yes, but it's not necessarily if you have Nahida, he's a better pull value, or if you have Nahida, he's a worse pull value. It depends on the kind of teams you want to be doing, and it depends on what you want out of your account. For me, Alhaitham is not a very good pull because I already have so many carries, and when it comes to the Dendro teams, I already have basically all of the options that I want. So if I were to pull for Alhaitham, I would barely play him. But yeah, like, I didn't pull him on my main account, I don't regret it, and I'm not going to go for him on my main account on the rerun. But there's definitely other accounts that have similar levels of investment to mine that can benefit from Alhaitham because they would actually hyper invest into him and actually like build his quicken teams for content that's like weak to Dendro. At the end of the day, I don't think right now on any account he's really like a useless pull. He's always gonna have some value, but I also don't think that he's, unless you already have a lot of the good units, I don't think he's gonna be like an insanely good pull either. But he definitely is better than average for sure. How good is he as a pull relative to the other dedicated 5-star on-field carries? The main upside that he has is that as a unit who's not really designed to be a hyper carry, he's inherently a lot more, I guess, future-proof in the sense that he has the ability to benefit from more different types of new units. Because he actually has a lot of damage in his kit, he could benefit from the equivalent of a Dendro, Goro / Farazan or whatever. But he could also benefit from a Hydro unit that works well in his Hyperloom teams, or an Electro unit that works well in either his Hyperlooms or his Quicken teams. So as such, his flexibility is an upside not just for the current things in the game, but also for potential future things in the game. But also just his teams just perform really well currently. The way the hyper carries are balanced is very often Hoyo assumes that if you really like a hyper carry, they can probably bait you into pulling for a constellation or two and end the signature weapon. So most hyper carries at C0 in a hyper carry role without a signature weapon are fine, but generally not all that competitive with the other good teams. And if you start going for the signature weapon and a C1 or a C2, then they start becoming a lot stronger. Alhaitham as a unit that's not really designed as a hyper carry kind of managed to dodge the Hoyoverse shitty monetization design and got garbage constellations. And as such, he kind of just tends to perform better at C0. There's a reason why people say that Alhaitham's C6 is not his C6, it's Nahida's C2. But yeah, I would say, as a poll, relative to the other dedicated 5-star on-field carries, he's probably the best one. Like, you could make an argument that Ayato is an on-field carry, and Ayato could be competitive with him under some situations. I think that Alhaitham is probably a better poll on average on most accounts, but there's definitely going to be accounts where Ayato would do better. How does he compare to the other on-field Hyperbloom drivers? He has damage. The other on-field Hyperbloom damage drivers often don't. Nahida does have some damage, not quite as much personal damage as he does, but in exchange for that, she has better app and a lot better AoE coverage. But overall, he's a pretty good driver for Hyperbloom. Is he technically a straight-up upgrade over Tighnari for spread? I've heard a lot of people say that. From what I understand, Tighnari does a little bit better when you're strictly in single target content and your rotations are perfect. But the good Tighnari teams have very difficult rotations. And also, as soon as you're not in single target content, he's not better anymore. When you are in single target content, you're not even going to notice the difference. And very often you're not in single target content. So basically, yeah, I'd call him a straight up upgrade over Tighnari for spread teams. Just tap E and rely on the auto targeting, or hold E for a plunge. When you use Alhaitham's E, you're still going to be on the ground. Like when you just tap it. It even does it even if you're like this. Yeah. It doesn't let you plunge, basically. You saw I was in the air and I was mashing my plunge attack, and he was just standing there and just fell. If you tap your E, you can't really plunge out of it. But if you hold your E, even if you're aiming here, even if you're aiming downwards, you'll be able to plunge out of it. Now, his mirrors will trigger the coordinated attack from normal charge and plunge attacks. And his talent gives him a stack of his mirrors on a charge or plunge attack, not on a normal attack. So what ends up happening is, if you do tap E, which means you can't plunge, and then you do a charge attack, well, when you do a charge attack, it always starts with a normal attack, which means that your normal attack will hit, you'll still be on 2 mirrors from the E, and it will throw a 2-mirror coordinated attack. Then your charge attack will hit, and you'll be at 3 mirrors, but you got to 3 mirrors, like right after you already sent a coordinated attack, which means that you can actually end up missing a proc of a 3-mirror hit, and only get 1 instead of 2. If you hold your E and then do a plunge attack, the plunge attack will give you a mirror, and if you get your mirror on the attack that triggers the mirror, it will count the new mirror that you got. Right, so when I do E into charge attack, right, you see I get the 2-mirror proc. But if I hold E first, I get the 3-mirror proc. In any case, but the point is, if you hold E, you generally tend to get 1 more proc of a 3-mirror hit. So most of the time you want to hold E. There are situations when tap E is fine. I mean, we'll talk about rotations later, but if you're doing the rotations where you start with burst and you use E and charge attack to refresh the 3-mirror duration, then you can tap E because you don't want to get both of them at once. How much damage does he get out of being leveled to 90? Yes, level your additive and transformative reaction units to 90, please. How well does he scale with vertical investment relative to the other prevalent on-field carries? It's a little weird. He can scale well with vertical investment, but not really through his constellations. If you're playing him in spread teams, I mean, in any teams, I guess, but it's more relevant in spread teams, his signature weapon can be a pretty decent damage increase, and then Nahida's C2 can be a good damage increase, and obviously good artifacts on him are very decent damage increases. And he's got a lot of good ways of scaling that are like outside of just him directly, that actually make it so that in terms of vertical investment, he actually does scale pretty well. And by the way, I guess I should reiterate that because some people are not used to videos on my channel. Vertical investment is basically when you focus both your resin spending and your Primogem spending on getting one specific team or unit to be stronger, rather than focusing it on leveling all of your units to get a bunch of different options that you can play. In any case, he does scale pretty well with vertical investment. Not the best, but still like decently, but not necessarily in the same ways as other units. How reliant is he on his burst, since it seems to be something people tend to gloss over pretty often? How much ER does he generally want in his usual teams with and without Nahida? Okay, the thing about this is it depends a lot. Alhaitham is a unit where, obviously, right, I use my E, I have 2 mirrors, I get, oh wait, I'm stupid. I wanted to show what happens when he swaps out, but I can't swap out because I don't have another party member right now. He's on 2. I swap, so back to him. Mirrors are gone, right? Which means that the more ER you have, the more flexible you are in your rotations. The more you can justify swapping out of him if you're scared for your life, or if the enemies are doing shit that with your rotations, like getting a shield with that you have to break with a specific element, or anything like that. Those things, they kind of with them a lot if you have just the amount of ER that you need. So personally, I actually just run him on 5 and don't bother. But it's definitely not necessary. There are many rotations that aren't too reliant on the burst, and many rotations that actually end up trying to cheat out more field time from him. And obviously the longer he's on field, the more procs he'll get of his mirrors, and because that's what generates energy in his kit, the more mirrors he'll get. And if you're also using Nahida, the longer your rotations, the more procs of her E you're gonna get. So you're gonna end up having very, very different ER requirements based on both your team and also just how well you're playing and how much you want to have, like how much flexibility you want to have. Generally, his like minimum requirements when you're playing with Nahida, 130, 140 is like generally more than enough. And you can maybe even get away with less. Outside of Nahida teams, it kind of jumps up a little because, well, the other Dendro units are not as good at generating Dendro energy, but it's still not that bad. And if you have 140, like, you should be fine if you play well on most teams. Artifact set overview. How does 4P's Gilded stack up against his options for mix and match? And is it enough of a gap to force a set bonus over stats? I mean, it's better, but is it enough of a gap to force set bonus over stats? The set bonus is stats, right? Like, that's what you have to keep in mind. Your set bonus, all that it does is it gives you stats. So the question then becomes, am I getting more stats from my set bonus or from my substats if I go on a 2-piece? And the answer to that is, it depends. Use the optimizer. I don't know what pieces you have, but the optimizer does, and it can help you. Is he a good 4-piece Deepwood carrier? He's not a bad 4-piece Deepwood carrier. You'd rather have someone else be the 4-piece Deepwood carrier because his personal damage, if he's staying on field, will obviously tank a little if you're using 4-piece Deepwood, but it won't tank a huge amount. So if you don't have another good Deepwood carrier on the team, you should put it on him, yeah. What main stats does he generally want on his pieces, and how much worse is attack and ER over EM sands on him? So obviously, the general idea is you want EM Dendro crit, but right now that's not what I'm running, because the only EM sands that I have on Gilded is glued to Raiden because it's my only EM sands on Gilded. I really wish I could use it on him because it's a pretty good artifact, but I can't, because if I do that, then my Raiden is not on 4-piece Gilded anymore, and that hurts my team's DPS a lot more than going on an attack sands on Alhaitham does. How much damage does he lose by going attack instead of EM? Generally, unless you have like really good substats on your attack sands and really bad substats on your EM sands, you'd rather run EM. Because it's not like Fischl, for example, where, well, you've got the talent damage that scales with attack and the reaction damage that scales with EM, and they both do about the same amount of damage, so, well, you can kind of just go for whichever one has substats. Alhaitham has that same thing, but also his talent scale with EM as well. So that obviously will skew things in favor of EM. Like, it's not going to be completely garbage to have an attack sands over an EM sands, but you would still rather get an EM sands if you can. Like, it's worth farming for an EM sands. Does he ever reach a point when EM's value as a substat falls off? I mean, yeah, every stat reaches a point where it falls off eventually, because the way that the stat formula works is, well, you have a stat and it's multiplied by another stat. If you have 1,000 multiplied by 1, gaining +1 on that 1,000 is a 0.1% increase. Gaining +1 on that 1 instead is 1,000 times 2, and that's 2,000, which is a 100% increase. So no matter how good a stat is, as long as it's still following that same, well, we're multiplying all these things together idea, only having that stat and lacking of the others will end up generally being suboptimal at some point. The reason why crit doesn't necessarily do that is because crit kind of feeds back into itself with crit rate and crit damage, right? The more crit rate you have, the better your crit damage is, and the more crit damage you have, the better crit rate is. But if you get enough of it, you'll get 100% crit, and once you have 100% crit, then it starts falling off. And actually, if you, let's do a little manual calculus. In order to simplify it, right, even if the base stats are supposed to be 5 to 50, let's start at 25 to 50, because it's the lowest stats you can have at a 1-to-2 ratio. And then let's just see what happens when you gain stats, and you gain stats, and you gain stats, and you gain stats, and you gain stats, up to 100. Very cool, right? As you can see, it goes up and up and up. But the actual percentage increase between each, which is generally what matters when you're comparing possible stats that you could be using, because again, right, this is your crit multiplier, it's multiplying the rest of the equation. And so, because it's multiplying the rest of the equation, then in order to figure out where your substats should be allocated, well, the place where the substat should be allocated is where the percentage increase on a different factor of your multiplication is the highest. So if we look at the percentage increase, right, we increase at the beginning by a little bit less than 1%. We can do it in terms of substats though, so do 6.6%, which is the crit value of an average crit value substat instead, and obviously this time we're going to stop a little bit earlier because we want to stop at 100 crit rate. If you look at the percentage that you gain on each substat, it goes up at the beginning, every new crit substat that you gain, but eventually, at around 70 crit rate, 70.7 more specifically, it stops. And instead of going up, it starts going back down. Even before you reach 100 crit rate, you do start getting this thing which is not actually mathematical diminishing returns, but the thing that most people understand as diminishing returns, where the percentage increase that you get from each new substat becomes lower the more of that substat you have. Once you're over 100 crit rate, it actually starts falling off faster and faster. Well, if we graph the percentage increase instead, you can see around here, which is around the 70 crit rate, which is 280 crit value, right? So right before 300. It stops going up on each one, and then once you reach around 400, here it's a little bit over 400 because I'm not doing an actual computation of it that's like proper. So we're going from 99, right? We're going from 397 to 404, right? So this is the data point where it starts going down, but around 400, it starts going down a bit more sharply. In any case, right, every stat, if you end up getting a lot of it, it starts being a bit worse to keep stacking it compared to potential other things that you could be doing. Now, Alhaitham gets bonuses from his EM into his damage, and bonuses from his EM into his motion value, and bonuses from his EM onto spread damage. Now, the spread damage has actual mathematical diminishing returns, but even then, right, the more stats, the better. It's just a question of, is there ever a situation where I'd rather have one roll of crit than 2 rolls of EM? And realistically, that kind of can happen if you actually reach the point where you cap out your passive, but it doesn't really happen before that. And then 3 rolls of EM versus 2 rolls of crit. It is going to depend a lot on what teams you're using, how often you're getting spreads, and all of that good stuff. One thing that might actually surprise you is that when it comes to spread damage, for Alhaitham, you'll pretty quickly reach a point where crit scales your spread damage better than EM does because of those diminishing returns on spread, and just the fact that spread can crit. And that's the same with every aggravate and spread unit. All in all, you never reach a point where EM's value becomes useless. You can reach a point where it becomes less valuable than potential other things you can get. It never really reaches a point where it's just strictly worse than attack. Once you have actually capped out your passive, right, once you already have 1000 EM with external buffs, then you're not gaining any real bonuses other than just the fact, like the scaling itself. So at that point, then it depends on your weapon, because your attack percent will scale your damage more if your base attack is higher than if your base attack is lower. Those breakpoints will change a lot based on the weapon you're using, the team you're using, and as such, it's really impossible to just have one that I can give you. And the conclusion that I want you to take away from this is more substats, more good. Better, yes, good, pog. Want more good things. Good things, more pog. Yes. Right? I think a lot of people would dismiss an artifact like this for Alhaitham as it doesn't have any EM, it has a very little crit, all it has is attack percent. And like, yeah, if these 5 rolls of attack were 5 rolls of crit instead, that would be better. But I'm not going to use this over it just because it has a little bit more crit value and some EM, because this is a lot of attack. And that's what it boils down to. It's just how much of it do you have. Weapon overview, Umbrella versus Iron Sting versus Harbinger. Okay, I don't like Harbinger on him because I don't think Kuki is very good at healing. And I think that in most teams, you're gonna end up using Kuki as your healer. And even when you are over 90% HP, it doesn't really perform that differently from an Iron Sting or an Umbrella. I think that most of the time, you're better off sticking to Iron Sting or Umbrella. In terms of which one is better, well, their passives give them the same stat, right? It's exact same stats, and the same base stats, is just the damage percent numbers that are different. R5 to R5, Umbrella gives 32% damage, Iron Sting gives 12% damage, so Umbrella is just better, right? Oh, that's right, you get 2 stacks of it, so it gives 24% damage. So Umbrella is just better, right? Because it's 32 instead of 24. Well, it's better in single target, but when you're in AoE, you'll only inflict Cursed Parasol onto one of the 2 enemies. Is 32% on one enemy better than 24% on both? Well, if one of the enemies is tankier than the other, and they're the one that have it, it can be. Otherwise, generally it's worse. Even then though, an 8% damage difference is just not all that relevant. And on the other hand, Iron Sting costs billets, which if you're using Sapwood Blade on someone, might kinda be cringe for you. I'd say that like the difference between them is minor enough that if you already have one of them leveled, or if you don't want to spend your billets on Iron Sting and already have the Umbrella, or if you miss the event and only have Iron Sting, just use what you have. It's really not that big of a deal. Foliar versus Jade Cutter, Mistsplitter, Huron, Freedom Sworn. Okay. But yeah, so his signature is generally his best 5-star option. It's by an okay margin. I mean, I never really recommend going for 5-star weapons unless you like are sure that's what you want, because you can usually reach DPS checks without needing to go for signature weapons, and unless you want to be speedrunning, most people will gain more fun out of their Genshin Impact experience by pulling for a new character than just having their numbers be a bit bigger. But when it comes to his free-to-play options versus the general 5 stars and his signature, he actually has like really good free-to-play options. Like this is actually an option of an example of a team where Harbinger would actually be really good because we're using Jolene and a healer, right? So it's very easy to stay above the 90% HP threshold. But yeah, all in all, if you can maintain over 90%, Harbinger is actually close enough to the other 5 stars that I would say, unless you already have them and have them leveled, like just stick to Harbinger. But most people don't end up playing teams like these. Many people will go for other things, so Harbinger won't always be as close. And then when it comes to Umbrella versus the 5-star and Iron Sting versus the 5-star options, they are decently behind, but like it's really not that huge of a difference compared to some other characters that scale a lot better with weapons, that have weapons that like help them a lot more. But yeah, all in all, he has really good free-to-play options. He has pretty good non-free-to-play options, just good weapon options. Oh yeah, I guess I haven't talked about Freedom Sworn. Let me just look at the sheet that I had earlier. Again, right, this is going to change potentially a lot based on the team you're using. But Freedom Sworn damage is quite a bit lower than the other 5-star options, but obviously you're getting the team buff. Depending on what your team is, depending on how well they're built, depending on what weapon they're on, all that good stuff, the actual value of Freedom Sworn can be better or worse. All in all, generally though, I'd say that it's, even if it is here about 5% behind, about 10% behind Jade Cutter and Mistsplitter, I'd probably put it around as good as them for overall team DPS in like usually. But like I said, it can end up changing a lot depending on what team you're using. One thing that can be a potential issue though is that very often you're not gonna get your 2 sigils before you swap into him. So if you're playing him with characters that snapshot, they won't get their bonuses because you have to cast their stuff before you go to him. Constellation overview. How is his constellation quality across the board? Bad. His constellations are not good. Let's go through them. When a projection attack hits an opponent, university and elaboration on forms cooldown is decreased by 1.2 seconds. This effect can be triggered once every 1 second. Basically, what that means is every 2 seconds, because you don't get these every 1 second, every 2 seconds, every time you get a proc, basically, your E cooldown goes down by 1.2 seconds. Now, depending on your rotation, the amount of time that the amount of stuff that you're actually getting out of this can change. Realistically though, in order for this to actually mean that you can use your E more times in a rotation, if you're doing repeatable rotations and not like asynchronous rotations, which is asynchronous rotations it's basically like you don't have a set rotation, you use things based on what's available, or you have like a 90-second rotation that doesn't do the same thing every 20 seconds, which generally is a lot fucking harder to do because it's a lot easier to fuck up and many more things can go wrong. But unless you're doing that, generally this doesn't actually translate to more ease per rotation. It does have basically the same effect as SAC in the sense of, well, not SAC, but I guess FAV to some extent, where it basically just punishes you less if you But his E cooldown is 18 seconds, right? So in order to be able to get 2 of it in a 25-second rotation, you need to get at least 5 procs on each one. So a total of 10 procs. That means that you're spending 20 seconds on him. 4 seconds on your supports. You don't have time to use 3 bursts and 3, 4, 5, 6 skills in 4 seconds. Animation times take longer than that. And that's without counting his own burst animation. So usually in like repeatable rotations, this doesn't actually mean more ease. So it's just a thing that's there to help you in case you fuck up your stuff. It can, however, help you if you see that the enemy's pretty low and you don't need another full rotation to kill them. Then you can E again, go back to him in a position where you wouldn't be able to if you didn't have C1. But like, all in all, this is just, it's kind of like Ayaka's C1. It's not completely useless. It has situations where it can actually be good, but it's just not great. Is C2. When Alhaitham generates a Chisel Light Mirror, his elemental mastery will increase by 50 for 8 seconds, max 4 stacks. Each stack's duration is counted independently. This effect can be triggered even when the maximum number of Chisel Light Mirrors has been reached. So, that means when you do the E hold into plunge, you gain 150 EM. When you use your burst at 0 stacks, you gain 150 EM. And if you accidentally f up and gain a mirror when you shouldn't, you gain another 50 EM. Basically, you can think of this as Alhaitham gains 150 elemental mastery. Is it $200 worth of stats? Well, I guess that's for you to decide. In my opinion, probably not. Increase University, an elaboration on form, which is the skill damage, the skill level by 3. It's okay. Most of his damage comes from his skill, but some of his skill damage is spread damage, which doesn't scale with talent level. So all in all, C3 is kind of just eh. C4, when particular field letters of phenomenon, that's what I'm calling it, and you can't stop me, is unleashed, the following effects will become active based on the number of Chisel Light Mirrors consumed and created this time around. So, when you use your ult, you gain buffs based on how many mirrors you used. If for each buff, or for each mirror that you had when you used it, you gain 30 EM, and for each mirror that you generated, you gain 10% Dendro damage. In other words, you gain 30% Dendro damage for 15 seconds when you use your ult. Most of the time, Alhaitham's ult is used at 0 mirrors to generate 3 mirrors. It's another like okay-ish stat increase. It helps his damage, but it's also not like all that great. It increases a multiplier that he should already have quite a bit, right? He should have a bunch of damage percent from his passive and Dendro Goblet. So it's not a 30% damage increase, it's a 30% damage percent increase, which is closer to like somewhere between 10 and 15. It's not bad, it's not great. Increased burst damage level, or burst level. This sucks. His burst damage is kind of shit, and his burst also spreads, which means that a good part of his pretty shit burst damage is spread damage, which doesn't get increased by this. This is not very good. And then finally, C6. 2 seconds after his ult is unleashed, he'll gain 3 mirrors, regardless of the number of mirrors consumed. And if he generates mirrors when his mirrors already maxed out, he gains additional crit and crit damage. This is obviously his first actual constellation. It's pretty good. It makes it so that you can actually use your ult with a bunch of mirrors active. One thing though that I would try to keep in mind, if you actually do end up going for this and you end up using it, your ult does not look at how much time there is left to your mirrors. All it looks at is how many mirrors you have when you cast it, which means you can hold E, plunge attack the enemy, and then attack them until you get your second 3 mirror hit, and you still have 3 mirrors for another like 1.5 seconds. Your next mirror hit will be a 2 mirror hit, but right now, in the moment, you're still at 3 mirrors. So if you use your ult after your second pronk of a 3 mirror hit, you will get the 10 attacks from it. On top of that, it will mean that you have less time left on this, which means that after you cast your ult, you can get a mirror back a little bit faster, basically. As like an overall thing on his constellations, I mean, his C6 is fine. It is actually a reasonable C6, but the constellations on the way to C6 are below average, and so the actual amount that he gains from constellations is not that much compared to a lot of the other 5 stars. His C2 is not very good. Like, it's not terrible, but like, if you're gonna go for 2 constellations on a 5-star unit to improve your Alhaitham team, go for C2 on Nahida. It increases Alhaitham's damage much more than this does, and if you play other teams, it increases those teams as well. Team overview, which archetype would I say is his best? Does he have any lesser used ones worth a try? At what level of investment does his spread team start to outdamage his Hyperbloom team? And how do those two compare against each other in general? So obviously, he's got 2 archetypes where he's good. He's got Quicken teams and he's got Hyperbloom teams. You can use him in Burgeon teams, but without any Quicken uptime, there's a bit less of an incentive to play him over some of the other Dendro units that do a bit less damage but offer more utility. So generally the main ones where he's used is Quicken teams and Hyperbloom teams. And by the way, when I say Hyperbloom, I am including Quick Bloom in there. As to which one is the best between the two, it kind of just depends what you're fighting and how invested you are. Because the reality is, like, artifact quality can impact Quicken teams output a lot, because Quicken scales much better with crit than it does with attack or EM, right? Both spread and aggravate. So your total team's DPS can end up like going a lot higher if you've got much better stats. Whereas when it comes to Hyperbloom teams, you'll generally have less Quicken uptime, and the Hyperbloom damage itself does not actually scale up that much from higher artifact investment. I'd say that the actual like main difference is that the Hyperbloom teams tend to be more comfortable to play because Xingqi is broken. Being able to slot in Xingqi on your team gives you resistance to interruption and damage reduction, and just, I mean, damage, obviously. But those two things are actually very helpful for Alhaitham, because Alhaitham is pretty easy to interrupt, so him getting that resistance to interruption is actually really useful. And if you're using him with Kuki, which very often you are, that means that your main defensive unit on your team is not offering you any resistance to interruption either. In Quicken teams, you can use Beidou instead, if you still want that resistance to interruption on a unit that does damage. But obviously Beidou is not as good when you're in single target, and her ER requirements are going to be a little bit higher if you're not using Fischl, which generally is what's going to end up happening with Alhaitham. All in all though, I mean, they're both good teams. Hyperbloom is a bit more single target focused. Quicken is a bit less single target focused. You can play both. You don't have to choose. You can just play whichever one is available to you based on what you want to play on your other team. One thing that I did not mention is Baizhu with him. When it comes to Quicken teams, Baizhu is actually very nice with him. The main issue that ends up potentially arising with Baizhu and his teams is that very, very often Alhaitham's best Electro option will be Kuki. Means that you're not getting that much damage out of an Electro unit. And if you're not going to get that much damage out of an Electro unit on a team, then why not get an Electro unit that also does something in terms of utility for your team? And that's why Kuki is generally such a good option for him. While he does work well with Baizhu, there's a bit less of an incentive to go for Baizhu if you have Kuki, because you already have a healer. So it liberates the slot, but it frees up the slot, but what are you putting on the slot you just freed up? You can put Yai, it's not bad. You're never gonna burst on her if she's solo Electro, and if you're putting 2 Electro units, I mean, who else? Like Beidou maybe? Yai and Beidou is still kind of a little sus in terms of energy requirements. You can put, I guess, Raiden as like an E-bot, just for like brainless quickens. You can put Raiden in like a quick swap way, I guess, which is also fine-ish. You can just put Fischl even if she doesn't have great synergy. She's still good enough of a unit that she's good there. But none of these options are all that great. So replacing your healer slot from Kuki to Baizhu doesn't give you access to that much upside. And because of that, most of the time it will be better to just use Kuki as your healer slot and have something else instead of Baizhu. That being said, you can use both if you want, but Baizhu is like a pretty low value unit in that situation, where if you have him and that's where you want to use him, that's fine. I mean, I get that his banner is gone by now, but people might be watching this on Baiju's rerun or something. Is he worth getting just for Alhaitham? Not really. At what level of investment does his spread team start to outdamage his Hyperbloom team? Again, right, it kind of just depends on the situations. Generally, until you start being like all your talents level 9 and actual like pretty solid fucking artifacts, you'll probably be getting faster clears with a Hyperbloom team. One thing to note though, part of that is because Quicken team rotations are generally a little bit danker than Hyperbloom team rotations. If you play well, that can also make Quicken teams a bit better. A lot of things can go into it. Does he have an optimal combo string? How reliant is he on always maintaining 3 mirrors? And what's the general gist of his rotations to follow in order to fully maximize the uptime on his mirrors? Does he have an optimal combo string? Yes. Do I know what it is? No. Does it matter? No. Reality is, there's such a small portion of his damage that comes from the actual normal attack talent that realistically, as long as you're getting your mirrors when you want to get your mirrors, that's what really matters. How reliant is he on always maintaining 3 mirrors? It actually depends a lot on what kind of rotation you're going for. When you're not getting too much uptime on your Quicken, then the reality is that you're not getting that much more damage out of 3 mirrors. The main reason why he does a lot more damage when 3 mirrors are active is because his E actually has a special ICD, which basically, instead of being the usual 3-hit 2.5 seconds, he actually has a 2-hit hit rule, which means that when you're getting a 3 mirror, your first and your third mirror can react. That being said, the second time you're getting 3 mirror, only your second mirror will react. When you have Quicken active, that matters a lot. When you don't, it matters a lot less. That being said, you still obviously have a lot more personal damage when you're getting 1 more mirror, so that it's still like good, but it's not as necessary. Different types of rotations will end up trying to go for different things. Mainly, depending on the other units you're using with him, they might want more field time, or they might not care about field time as much, or they might want to be swapped into every 10 seconds, or be okay being swapped into only once per rotation. And there's basically 2 ways of going about it. Either you do the hold E trick, you have 2 attacks with 3 mirrors, and then you either swap out and then come back to him and use your burst and have another 2 attacks with 3 mirrors, or you keep going with 2 mirrors and then you swap out after that and do the same thing, or you can even keep going with 1 mirror, basically depending on what your team is trying to do, whether or not you need to swap back into your characters. And then you do the same thing with the ult. You can also do it on the other order, it doesn't really matter. The other way you can go about it is you start with your ult, and then you do attacks with 3 mirrors, you get 2 3-mirror procs, then you do a charge attack, you keep going, you get another 2 3-mirror procs, then you do an E, and you keep going, and you get another 2 3-mirror procs, and then you swap out. Technically, if you're going for 24+ second rotations, it is also possible to do the first thing I mentioned, which is the E into plunge trick, do your stuff, you get 2 3-mirror procs, and then either keep going or swap into characters that need a lot of field time. And if you time it right, you can actually, when you go back to Alhaitham, you use your ult, your passive with a 12-second cooldown can actually be off cooldown, and you can get this again. Or you can do it the other way around by starting with the burst and getting it there, and then doing the hold E afterwards. It can be possible to basically cheat out 1 more proc of this, but it will require much better rotations because it's not just getting it, it's getting it early enough that the next rotation around, it's back off cooldown again for the start of your rotation. Xingqi versus Yelan for an On-field Hyperbloom team. The answer to this question won't surprise you. I would always recommend Xingqi, but part of that is because of Xingqi's defensive utility. If Xingqi did not offer that resistance to interruption and damage reduction, you would actually generally rather go for Yelan, because in Alhaitham Hyperbloom, yeah, if you're applying more Hydro, you're generating more blooms. In exchange for that, though, you're losing Quicken uptime. So usually, when you're playing a Hyperbloom team with a Dendro unit that is actually built for damage, more Hyperblooms, less Quicken uptime, or more Quicken uptime, less Hyperbloom, they kind of cancel each other out. And then, if they do cancel each other out, then Yelan has that additional damage bonus for Alhaitham. All in all, I'd say that Alhaitham really does feel kind of painful without resistance or interruption. So if you're playing him with Yelan, I would highly recommend trying to fit resistance interruption on another member of your team, but that can be pretty difficult, which is part of why I'd say that Xingqi is still generally overall better for him. But obviously, again, right, if you're willing to reset, if you're willing to spend more time learning enemy attack patterns, all that good stuff, Yelan has a higher ceiling in Alhaitham teams. And also, more importantly, Yelan is good in Alhaitham teams, and Xingqi is good everywhere. So using Yelan on your Alhaitham team lets you have Xingqi available for your other half, which is good. Double Dendro, double Electro spread versus triple Dendro, solo Electro spread. Generally, there's not really a good third Dendro to use. If you're using Baiju or I guess Yao as your healer in your third slot, what are you going to put as your Electro? Again, you can use something like Yai, but it's kind of Generally, I'd lean towards the double Electro, double Dendro, if those are the two things you're considering. They're not the only things you can consider, though. Even though someone like Kazuha or Sucrose or even Venti doesn't increase Dendro damage by shredding Dendro resistance, grouping is broken. So if you're in chambers that need grouping, those units are always good, even if you can't take advantage of the VV. In general, though, the last slot is pretty flexible, so you can use it for a shield breaking unit if you really need it. I do actually quite like using Beto in the last slot to something like this, because it gives you resistance to interruption on your quicken team, or I guess, sorry, something like this. Because it gives you resistance to interruption on your quicken team. I think Beto is a unit that, like, people have kind of just forgore about her by now, and people just in general don't realize how useful the damage reduction and resistance to interruption from her burst can be, and just forget that it's there, that it's a part of her kit. And it actually does matter a pretty significant amount. This is one of the more comfortable Alhaitham teams. Obviously, you can also use Zhongli if you don't want to do double Electro. You've got a few options, really. How does Yai fare in his teams, especially in a solo Electro situations relative to other Electros like Kuki and Fischl? Again, right, with Kuki, she's a healer, and none of the Electro units are that insane in solo Electro, so generally I lean towards Kuki. But Yai is still fine, right? Like, she's still fine in his teams. She still does damage. The main thing is, like, when you're playing Yai as a solo Electro, you will burst every, like, 83 rotations. If we're actually, like, calculating how much ER you need, which means that to burst every rotation, you need about 260 ER. To burst every other rotation, you need about 130. However, you're gonna have to learn to, I mean, your timings on using your E will have to be different on the rotation that has the ult and not on the rotation that doesn't, because obviously, right, the ult resets thing. So all in all, generally, if you do use Yai, it's gonna be at most one ult every 2 rotations, unless you're killing enemies really fast and you're getting a lot of HP particles from them, or you're doing something like double Electro, which was not what the question was, right? The question was in solo Electro. When you don't have that ult, right, most of Yai's damage is single target. The damage overall is like, it's fine, it's decent, but she has pretty long field times, which reduces the amount of time that you can spend on Alhaitham. Overall, it's good. It is something that you can do, and it's far from bad, but it's generally not the thing I'd recommend. If you want to play Yai in his teams, I would generally recommend going for a double Electro team with Yai and Kuki, where you can actually ult every rotation. And generally, I would not recommend Fischl in his teams unless you don't have Kuki. I really think it's a waste to use Fischl in his teams. Do any of his teams benefit much from Kazuha? I mean, any team benefits from a grouper when you need a grouper, whether it be Kazuha, Venti, or Sucrose. Is using Kazuha in his teams generally better than using Kazuha in other teams? No. Not only are you not increasing your Electro character's damage because you don't have Electro characters that are there to deal damage in your Alhaitham teams, especially if you're using a slot on Kazuha, most of the time your Electro slot's going to be Kuki, but also because you're going to be on-fielding Alhaitham, you're going to be playing a lot of Dendro, what's going to end up happening is the enemies will have Quicken and underlying Dendro on them. Now here's the problem with that. When you use Kazuha's ult, normally, every time that it procs, you'll see 2 Electro numbers, right? There's a 40 and a 615. And once he loses the big things, right? There's a 600-ish on a crit and a 5,000-ish on a non-crit. The 5,000 is the swirl. And that's the biggest portion of his damage. Here's the problem when you apply too much Dendro to an enemy. We only get 1 number now. We're only getting 1 Electro number because we're not swirling anymore. In order to swirl, you need the enemy to have Electro on them. And when you apply too much Dendro, not only do you get your Quicken, but you also get a Dendro aura on top of that doesn't show up on your screen, but it is there, and it prevents Electro from being applied. Which means that if you apply a lot of Dendro, you are obliterating your Kazuha's personal damage. He goes from being a unit with pretty good personal damage and grouping to a unit that does basically no damage. It's one of the few situations where Kazuha on an attack build is actually better, just because you're not swirling. So just keep that in mind if you are putting Kazuha in his teams. His personal damage will not be all that good. You are also generally just better off using Sucrose because this part of Sucrose's passive, which is the biggest part of her EM sharing, or of her EM buff, increase all party members, excluding Sucrose's Elemental Mastery. Not just the one of the element she swirled or anything, it's a buff to all your team. And you can pretty reasonably get about 800 EM on, don't look at that, and definitely I'll look at the... You can pretty reasonably get about 800 EM on your Sucrose, so that's like a 160-ish EM buff for your Alhaitham. So if you want a grouper, in terms of like your damage, if you are using an Alhaitham or the traditional Alhaitham team, you're generally better off using Sucrose. Is his power level sufficient to pull in spite of his admittedly abrasive personality? No. He's annoying and cringe, and you shouldn't pull for him. Can I get abs like his if I were to also become a feeble scholar? I mean, it depends. If you want to be just like him, just behave like he would and do one sit-up every time someone audibly sighs in your presence. I promise you, you are going to get so fucking jacked. You will literally be on the cover of, I don't know, what kind of magazines have hot men on their covers? Or hot women, I guess. But like muscular hot women or men. Men's Health? Sure, on the cover of a Men's Health magazine, I don't know. Anyways, lastly, can you do some of his voice lines in both English and Japanese? Flicker. A process of elimination. Here you are. Diffract. Moratta. Sunlight. Kyosen. Hironno Ennyaki. I can't, man. I'm sorry. I feel like this was one of the worst ones I've done so far, but it is what it is.